Good morning, everybody. Today we are taking up gate 45 of the 108 gates of Dharma illumination. So our gate statement for today says, knowledge of names and forms is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it clears away many obstacles. So that sounds pretty straightforward, but actually that translation is a sort of a condensed version of all the stuff that's actually in the original statement, right? It's alluding to a lot of things. There's a lot of stuff to unpack and talk about there. So we have lots to chew on today on this gate statement. So if we were to expand this to include all of the things that are being alluded to and all the little sections that are sort of, not in the English version, it might be something like understanding the harmony of the four classical elements, which is earth, air, fire, water, as they become the body within name and form, which is the first of the five skandhas, is a Dharma gate, because when we understand it, we don't fall prey to the three poisons and the resulting delusions that we encounter in the samsaric world. Phew. That's long and involved. So you can see, there's plenty to chew on there. So first we need to talk about name and form as it relates to the five skandhas. Then we need to see how these four classical elements of earth, air, fire, and water kind of fit into that whole thing. And then we get to look at seeing, how understanding that whole process helps us avoid obstacles, right, as we sort of navigate this samsaric world. So we have a lot, a lot on our plates this morning. So let's start with the five skandhas. Quick review: form, feeling, perception, formation, unconsciousness. The things that we encounter in the Heart Sutra and in other places in our tradition. These are the building blocks of the body and mind in the small self, right? So to just, Reader's Digest version, because this is familiar territory, right? Form in general means the physical, tangible things that we encounter. But within the five skandhas, it's a description of the individual person, right? It's the body and mind of the individual person. So that includes the sense organs that perceive the external world. And that becomes important as we go along. So that's the first one. The second one is feeling. Feeling is getting that sense information, right? Getting what's coming in through our senses. Perception is the third one. That's creating the mental images and the concepts and the ideas out of that sense information. Fourth is formation. That's the will that actually acts on those images or ideas. That's our motivation for action. And the fifth one is consciousness. And consciousness does the discernment and integrates the feeling, perception, formation, right? So very quick review of five skandhas. So out of all of that, we have this sense of self. Somehow this sense of a solid self arises. It seems to be a fixed thing that persists through time, but really, as we see, it's just a changing collection of these five skandhas. So the term nama rupa, or name and form, is sometimes used interchangeably with five skandhas, but it can also mean just the simplest categories of the components of the individual. So the mental intangible aspects are nama, or name. The physical tangible aspects are form, or rupa, right? So we have name and form. We have body and mind. We have the physical tangible, and we have the mental sort of intangible. So this is name and form in this gate statement when it says knowledge of names and forms. This is names and forms. So when Namarupa is related to the skandhas, then the last four, the feeling, perception, formation, consciousness, are the intangible. That's the mental part. That's the nama, or name, right? That's the mental stuff. The first skandha, which is formed from these four elements, earth, air, fire, water, creates the body, creates form, rupa. We'll go into all of that in a little bit. So the first skandha, form, is, again, this tangible physical piece, the physical aspect of life. The other four are the psychological or the spiritual aspect. So it seems like we can create distinction. There's the form, the tangible, the body, the physical, and then there's the intangible, the other four. It seems like we can draw a line, but actually, as we know, these are really inseparable. Body and mind are really inseparable, because without body, we wouldn't have consciousness, right? We couldn't have sort of one side without the other side. They have to work together. So all beings are carrying on their practice and carrying on their daily lives and daily activities because of the interaction of these 5 skandhas, right? Somehow these 5 skandhas come together. Something arises out of that. This is how we actually do our practice and live our lives in the world. So those activities, those operations are influenced by karmic conditions of this moment, and they also set up the karmic conditions for something that's going to unfold. And we'll come back to that also, right? So there's lots of operations happening, lots of processes, lots of forming, lots of becoming, lots of arising, right? This is really dynamic. This is not a case where, well, we have these elements and they kind of just lie there, right? They're interacting, they're changing, they're moving. This is, there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of motion here. So what's the relationship between name and form, or the body, and these 4 classical elements that we talked about? So these 4 elements are, they go all the way back to ancient India, but of course we know they show up in other cultures. They show up in Greece and Rome and other places. For today, we're talking about them, related to this, but we know it goes broader than that, right? So earth, air, fire, water are the basis for the arising of all the forms there are, all the forms that we encounter. So just as the 5 skandhas come together and make up a self, or something we call a self, right? The 4 elements come together to make up the body. And the physical world, the tangible things that we encounter. So these forms, or these collections, hold together for a little while because of the interacting energies. All these things are coming together. There's some kind of energy there. They hold together for a little while because there is balance, or because there is harmony amongst these elements. But we all know, things are impermanent. Conditioned things are impermanent. So, this is of course true of forms. Everything arises and stabilizes and decays and dissolves. We know this is just this constant moving, changing cycle. So it's a reflection of the changing balance of the energies, so it's said, between these 4 elements. We might say there's creative tension, to put it in a modern way, among these 4 elements, and for a while they can hold together. And when that energy changes, or when that balance changes, then the form doesn't hold together anymore. So after some period of time, this form that can't hold itself together starts to decay and dissolve and disperse. So if we don't understand that process, if we don't understand the things come together, that we think there's a solid self, but it's actually a moving, changing collection, that there's nothing we can grasp, if we don't have insight into that, we can easily fall prey to the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. We start clinging to things. We start clinging to self. And immediately suffering arises. I mean, it's just the most basic part of our practice, right? This is how suffering comes to be, and how it gets perpetuated, and why it's hard to be liberated from that. So 4 elements are the primary components of form, or rupa. Form is the first of the 5 skandhas. The 5 skandhas are the ultimate basis for suffering in the 4 Noble Truths. So if we're going to clearly, deeply understand the 4 Noble Truths, and if we're going to clear away obstacles, the way this gate is encouraging us to do, then we need to understand the 4 elements, and we need to understand name and form, and how these things interact. So early Buddhists, one of the early Buddhist practices was to contemplate the body during sitting practice or meditation practice, and to try to cultivate a really deep experience or deep understanding that the body was made up of these 4 elements, and that these 4 elements were still present, right? So in that sitting practice, there were some techniques and practices around really deeply getting in touch with that. The 4 elements are said to create not only the forms that we encounter, but also the qualities of those forms. So earth gives solidity, and water gives moisture, and fire gives heat, and wind gives motion. So we can see some correlation there, right? These qualities are coming from these 4 classical elements, and this is, when we encounter forms in the world, including this body, we see that very direct connection. So those qualities were said to correspond with some of the intrinsic functions of the universe. So, we're starting very small with small elements, and now we're all the way up to there's a reflection in the larger universe itself. The earth was about sustaining and preserving. Water is about gathering and containing. Fire is about providing the heat that matures something, and wind causes growth, right? So there's this big reflection worldwide kind of universal reflection of what's going on, in a very basic individual way. So this should all sound very familiar if you have encountered at all the Sandokai, or the harmony of difference and sameness, which says the four elements return to their natures. Just as a child turns to its mother, fire heats, wind moves, water wets, earth is solid, eye and sights, ear and sounds, nose and smells, tongue and tastes. Thus, with each and every thing, depending on these roots, the leaves spread forth. So that's a well-known passage of that poem. So it's a description of the four elements coming together to make up the body, which includes the sense organs, and then the sense organs have contact with something leading to the five skandhas, and from there we create our world, right? Somehow the leaves and branches spread forth, right, from those roots. So, that process goes on and builds and builds and builds, right? And we sort of act on our ideas and we manifest some things in the world. So at that point, now we get to talk about the connection with the 12-fold chain of causation. So I'm not going to get too technical about this. You know about the 12-fold chain, and you can, find other information about that. But, quick review, it starts with ignorance or unawareness of the nature of self. If we don't know what this self is about, then we start to think that the self and the world have some separate nature, some fixed, separate, permanent nature. The second one is conditions. So we have to have the necessary circumstances that allow these karmic seeds or causes to come to fruition. And those causes and conditions set the stage then for the next things to go forward. So we have the causes and conditions that led us to here, and then we have causes and conditions that are continuing to unfold. Third one is consciousness, which is this sort of arising of a sense of self, and it operates through the mind and the senses. And the fourth one, guess what? Name and form. So here we are again, the totality of the individual's sort of mental, physical components. So this is body and mind. And here we are again with body and mind. So I'm not going to go through the rest of the whole 8. For our purposes, the important point was, at some point in this 12-fold chain, we get to name and form. So name and form includes both body and mind. And, it sees these things as distinct but not separate. So we can point to something we call a body, we can distinguish it from, the mental faculties or something we're calling a mind. And in our day-to-day world, we may need to make that distinction. But what's important is to remember they're not actually separate, right? So just as the 4 elements are distinct but not separate from form, and the 5 skandhas are distinct but not separate from each other, we have body and mind, we can point to them, but they're not actually disconnected. So on one hand, we have all these kinds of non-separation. We're always hearing about non-separation, how everything is one piece, right? Seeing body and mind as one piece. At the same time, we know that, the reality is that body and mind are not fixed. They're not one solid piece that doesn't change. They're only changing piles of aggregates or changing skandhas, right? So we get to hold both of these things at the same time. So Dogen says this in Zazen Yojinki: just mind, just body. Difference and sameness miss the point. Body arises in mind, and when the body arises, they appear to be distinguished. When one wave arises, 1,000 waves follow. The moment a single mental fabrication arises, numberless things appear. So the 4 elements and the 5 aggregates mesh, 4 limbs and 5 senses appear, and on, until the 36 body parts in the 12-fold chain of interdependent emergence. Once fabrication arises, it develops continuity, but it still only exists through the piling up of myriad dharmas, which is what we've just said. The mind is like the ocean waters, the body like the waves. There are no waves without water, and no water without waves. Water and waves are not separate. Motion and stillness are not different. So it is said, a person comes and goes, lives and dies as the imperishable body of the 4 elements and the 5 aggregates. So he's describing how these 4 elements and 5 aggregates come together, and how the body and the sense organs arise. And once we have consciousness, then we have clinging to name and form and what we think this self is, all the physical and mental aspects of this small self. We start writing stories about all that, all those data. We have all kinds of ideas about that, these things that come in through our senses. Then we start chasing after the things we like and start running away from the things we don't like and labeling things. And from there, we have the whole human experience that the Buddha describes in the Four Noble Truths, right? So immediately all of these things start to arise. So it's no wonder that in this passage, he's saying as soon as there's one wave, there are myriad waves. And pretty soon we have form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness. So our practice is to understand that process so we don't get caught up in delusions about self and the three poisonous minds and all the clinging and the running and the chasing and the aversion that goes with that stuff. So, you know, mainly it's delusions about separateness and permanence, right? So the opposite of interconnection and impermanence is where we get stuck. We kind of forget those things. So that's the basis for the obstacles in the gate statement that we heard in the beginning, right? The things that get cleared away. So if we understand this process of arising and becoming and coming together, and through that we clearly see the nature of self, then the obstacles that come with that kind of self-clinging get cleared away. So long before Dogen, Bodhidharma actually had exactly the same thing to say. He said, when a great bodhisattva delves deeply into perfect wisdom, he realizes that the four elements and the five shades are devoid of a permanent self. So this is not, of course, new to Dogen, right? This goes way back in our tradition. So we call this first skanda form. Typically we call it form in English, but the Chinese and Japanese word is actually color, which is interesting. This meaning of color is anything that blocks your line of sight, right? Anything that blocks your view. So that's fine for, you know, walls and books and cats and dogs and stuff. It doesn't work so well with things like wind or water or glass or things we can see through, right? So sometimes it doesn't work so well. Anyway, but that's the original word. You know, originally it's about color. So there are forms that are internal, right? Internal to us, related to our own bodies. We might be in closer touch with what those four elements are doing, related to what we perceive is going on in this body. So if we don't feel well, you know, we feel ill, or we are going to take some physical action, going to physically move around, we're in pretty immediate touch with the workings of those four elements. In ancient India, of course, and on to other cultures, the feeling was that, you know, illness was the result of these four things being out of balance, right? Out of harmony. We somehow needed to balance all of the things that each of these elements would bring to whatever they were making up. So earth is related to the weight and the solidity of the body. Moisture, of course, is all the fluids. Water is all the fluids and all the moisture. Fire is the temperature, of course. And wind is movement, our vibrations, right? All the activity that's going on in the body. So when these things are in harmony, it's said, then the body is healthy. And when they're not in harmony, we have illness or we have death. Somehow this form can't hold together. So there are also forms that are external, which are not part of our immediate personal bodies. We're perhaps less closely in touch with what those four elements are doing when we perceive they're somewhere out here in the world. What they're doing in the larger world, we can think we're separate from that, right? That's not about me. That's something happening outside. So we can see that this whole thing is just really another way to consider interconnection. Are we actually separate from what the four elements are doing out there, right? From the processes that are going on out there. It's the same four elements that make up this body and also make up the rest of this universe and the rest of what's happening. So Dogen says, when you bring forth your body, mind, and practice, and when you bring forth the body, mind, and practice of others, the power of practice with the four elements and the five skandhas is immediately actualized. So this phrase, four elements and five skandhas, is actually important as a phrase. Shidai Goun is the phrase. It's a traditional Buddhist phrase for body and mind. So when he's talking about four elements and five skandhas, what he's talking about is body and mind. So it shows how the four elements that make up the external environment are also what make up the body and also what make up the mind. So these things are really inseparable, right? They're really interconnected. So the reference to the four elements is built into the term for body and mind, right? Anytime body and mind comes up, the four elements are there. So there's an allusion always to those four elements. So every time we run across body and mind in a text as a phrase, we get to recall that it implies four elements and five skandhas. So anytime you're reading Dogen, you're reading a text, four elements and five skandhas, that's the entire body-mind complex, right? That's what it's alluding to. So the first skanda, which we said was form, or the body, is very much about here and now, here and nowness, if you will. So if we read that Dogen quote again, when you bring forth your body, mind, and practice, and when you bring forth the body, mind, and practice of others, the power of practice with the 4 elements and the 5 skandhas is immediately actualized. So, it's exactly with this body and mind that we manifest awakening. That's not going to happen anywhere outside of 4 elements and 5 skandhas. So we can't do it just with thinking, right? It's not just a mental process. It's not just an intangible thing, which only involves some of the skandhas. It's the entirety of all of those 5 skandhas. So Dogen says when we sit down, the complete functioning of all those 4 elements and all those 5 skandhas is immediately carried out. As soon as we sit down, we're actualizing all of those things. So as the gate says, when we can see how name and form arise from those 4 elements, we can keep from getting caught up in our delusion, our mistakes. So in Fascal Yobutsu, I can't, my eyes aren't working today. Yobutsu, which is only a Buddha and a Buddha. Dogen says that if we don't see clearly how this process happens, then we start to pile up fixed ideas about self. And then we start to go off the rails, right? So, we start to build up these stories about what self is. We start adding in some personal experiences, right? Some personal responses to what we think is happening. Right there, we've lost sight of the true nature of self, right? So based on that faulty understanding, we start to make mistakes. So we can see why this gate statement is saying this is like something really, really basic that we need to see into, right? Look into. So Dogen says, this means that we cannot see the 4 elements and the 5 aggregates of the present as ourself, and we cannot trace them as someone else. Thus, the colors of the mind excited by a flower or the moon should not be seen as self at all, but we think of them as ourself, right? So now we have some ignorance. We don't quite understand how this process works. And out of that ignorance comes delusion and hindrance and suffering and obstacles. So we lose sight of the self as an impermanent collection of those 4 elements and 5 skandhas. We get so fixated on small self that we can forget about universal self, right? We forget about the rest of it because we're so fixated on what we think is happening here, our stories about what's happening here. Even though, of course, we're already interconnected. Individual self and universal self are already interconnected. Doesn't matter what we think about that. Doesn't matter what we do or don't do about that. Of course, that's already true. So instead, we need to see that the 4 elements are constantly changing according to causes and conditions. We can't forget cause and effect. So the skandhas are also always changing. If the 4 elements are always changing, and that's what makes up that first skandha and the rest of them, then somehow we know all of that has to be changing. If causes and conditions are changing, then anything that arises from causes and conditions also has to be changing, right? So we have impermanence. We would like somehow to forget that, right? We would like to point to a fixed center that we can call I, because that feels comfortable, right? That feels safe. But pretty soon, we're looking beyond the I to the source of the I. And then, there's really only this collection of changing elements that are making this up. They join together for some period of time in a collection. So if we can see that and somehow have some personal experience or insight into that, it keeps us from kind of going off the rails. So if we forget that, then we start to give things names. We decide whether we like them or not. After a while, things sort of come and go, fall to pieces again. We have suffering. There's no part of that collection we can point to and say, this is a fixed and permanent I, right? The collection arises, we write some stories about it, somehow that collection changes, the form changes, the body changes, and we look at that and say, there's nothing I can point to or grasp forever and ever and say, this is I, this is me. So sometimes we can see clearly how we can use the body as made up of the 4 elements to perpetuate our delusions about self. So even though we know at some level this body is an impermanent changing collection of things, somehow we can find ways to write stories about it, to use it to perpetuate our delusions. So for instance, in order to live, the body has to carry out some chemical processes, right? In order for that to go on and for life to be sustained, we have to eat. We have to put food into this body so that we have nutrition and the body can stay alive. So it's important to take care of the body, right? As the ground of our practice. We shouldn't be ignoring the health of the body. This is how we carry out bodhisattva work. There's nowhere that's going to happen outside of this collection of 5 skandhas. But we all know that food can become a big part of our identity, right? A big part of our clinging, our self-clinging. So sometimes we eat for comfort. If we're feeling our suffering, right? We're feeling uncomfortable, we eat comfort food, or we eat when we're bored or something. Sometimes we choose food based on likes and dislikes and our perceptions about food. We eat too much of the things we don't like, the things we like. We try to avoid things that are healthy, but maybe aren't so appealing, right? We start making a lot of choices. We starve ourselves because we want to look a certain way. There's just lots of stuff around food. All kinds of reasons beyond this body needs nourishment in order that we can carry on our practice. So it's possible to care for the body without getting caught up in the 3 poisons, which is good news. So the Chinese Zen master Huang Po said, when the body, composed of the 4 elements, suffers the pangs of hunger, and accordingly you provide it with food, but without greed, that is called wise eating. On the other hand, if you gluttonously delight in purity and flavor, you are permitting the distinctions which arise from wrong thinking. Merely seeking to gratify the organ of taste without realizing when you have had enough is called sensual eating, right? So Buddha learned, we know early on, that neither too much luxury or too much ascetic practice are helpful in liberating ourselves from suffering. They both reinforce some idea about a fixed and permanent self. Both of those things are about clinging to self-image. So we have to clear away obstacles by really looking at cause and effect and how our sense data becomes larger than the sum of its parts, if you will, right? We take in all of these sense data and we create something out of that. And then we perpetuate delusion and suffering, right? So we can ask ourselves, how did the 4 elements and the 5 skandhas become this person? That's a deep question. Can we really see how that happens? How are the 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas, is the way Hojo-san puts it. 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas. How is that happening in ways that ignore reality? Like, how can a changing collection of things cling to itself? Which is a really interesting kind of puzzle. It's a really interesting thing to practice with. So, how is that all creating suffering for myself and for others? How are we putting obstacles in our path and in the path of other people? So, our ability to be open-hearted, for instance, rather than to be self-involved, rests with our understanding of 5 skandhas, name and form, and how those things arise. So if we can't see the emptiness of the skandhas and the emptiness of the self, then we're always going to have some clinging and aversion and suffering. So of course, that's one of the main points of the Heart Sutra that we're about to chant after we finish here for our World Peace Ceremony. So the Heart Sutra is a good place to kind of begin to wrap up. So in the beginning of the Heart Sutra, it says, of course, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, clearly saw that all 5 aggregates are empty and thus relieved all suffering. So Hojo-san has written about generosity, that generosity is based on prajna, or wisdom, related to seeing the emptiness of those 5 skandhas. If we really see that process, if we see the emptiness of the 5 skandhas, it enables our generosity because we loosen that grip of self-clinging. There's nothing to cling to. If we're not clinging to self, we're in a much better position to see the suffering of others or to be in a position to help others or offer something wholesome in the world. So he says, these 5 aggregates are the elements of all beings. Avalokiteshvara saw that there is nothing that exists other than the 5 aggregates, and he also clearly saw that even those 5 aggregates are empty. Empty means there is no inherent nature that makes things fixed, substantial, or permanent. Things are only a collection of the 5 aggregates that are coming and going, arising and perishing, and gathering and scattering. But the 5 aggregates themselves are also empty and have no self-nature. When we see the reality of the emptiness of the 5 aggregates, that is in the case of human beings, of our bodies and minds, we can be free from attachment to them. The body is composed of rupa, form, right? And the other 4 elements constitute the functionings of our minds. Nothing exists other than the body and mind that are conditioned and always changing. So that's what Hojo-san has to say about that. So this is a basic teaching of our tradition. Although we hear about it all the time, it's worth coming back to once in a while and sort of considering or reconsidering. We need to have some self-identity, of course, just to move through the world, right? In order to have some psychological well-being, we need to have some kind of idea about who we are, what the limitations are, what the bounds are of this body and mind. But we also need to see how that's created, how we create that, how we take in sense data, start writing stories, generating ideas, labeling things, taking actions, and taking actions that reinforce the sense of self. So we see how this is all sort of a self-fulfilling cycle, right? So we need to see through that, see how it's created and reinforced, how we can cling to a self that doesn't have any fixed and permanent self nature, even though there's nothing we can grasp somehow, we're going to cling, we're going to grab, try to do something with that. And we need to see how we forget that we're made up of the same elements as everything else, as the world around us. So any feeling of being separate, having a fixed separate self nature doesn't hold up, right? Doesn't make sense. As long as we remember that there is that continuity, as one of the other quotes said, there's the continuity between this body and mind and everything else that's around it. So when we really know about the processes of name and form, then the obstacles we stumble over kind of get cleared away. So the gate statement, reminds us that we need to reconsider that. We need to hold that in mind and practice with that. So I've thrown out lots to chew on today. I want to stop talking and see what you all have to say. I kind of covered a lot of territory, so there may be things that were feel disconnected or things you want to follow up on. So what would you like to say about your experience of any of that? Oh, here comes Mark.
So what's the relationship between name and form again?
I can hardly hear you. The relationship between
Name and form. Hold on.
Did anyone else hear him?
How about now? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, better.
All right. So what's the relationship between name and form again?
Name and form. Okay. So form is the physical, tangible stuff, right? And name is the intangible mental parts of that whole 5 Skandas system, right? So yeah, so feeling, perception, formation, that stuff is the name part, and the body, the physical part, is the form. Although I have to say, that's in this particular context. If you really start looking into name and form, it shows up in lots of places and has lots of connotations and permutations. So for the purposes of just talking about this gate, I'm using it in that way.
Okay, because I mean, when you got done with Dogen's, the first quote from Dogen, the first question that came to mind was, does a sleepwalker have name and form? I mean, it seems like they have a body, but they're not conscious, but they're still moving consciously. And to me, it just, there's some things that just don't seem to jive here.
Yeah. So name includes consciousness, but it's all the mental processes. So if you're alive and you're sleeping, you still have mental processes happening, right? So if you're sleeping, those functions are still happening. You might be dreaming. Something's happening here, right? So name and form are still there, even if you're sleepwalking.
But you can be alive without thinking, dreaming, etc. For example, being put under for surgery,
right?
Medication, propofol or whatever it's called, a really wonderful drug. You'll have one without the other. You can't. It doesn't seem they don't seem to go together. They don't. Being alive and conscious don't seem to go together.
Being alive and conscious don't seem to go together.
I'm alive before I'm conscious. I am born, I was not there. consciousness is a developmental process. I'll be there when I die, maybe, right? There's no guarantee that I'll be there. I could become, I forgot, mentally deficient, et cetera, et cetera.
But I think if we go back to the talk last week, that's a very sort of Western-centric view of the world, right? Because we tend to favor matter over mind. We think that mind arises from matter. But Buddhism kind of traditionally doesn't really see the world that way, as consciousness arising from the body. So I think that if we talk about I existed as a physical thing before I had consciousness, a Buddhist could say, well, you didn't really exist because you didn't have consciousness, or something like that. It's only from sort of an outside perspective that is the case, right?
Thank you for jumping in, because you've done some studying on Yogacara and mind only. So please fill in gaps, because of course I'm doing a very high level, quick thing, and you have some detail that I probably don't have. So please feel free to jump in.
I mean, I don't think that what Mark is saying is incorrect or anything. It's just a different way of viewing the world than really Buddhists sort of viewed it.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. I hope others could hear you better than I. Okay. Other things people would like to bring up? Sagan, please.
I'm kind of curious about how memory fits into this whole thing. I mean, in a sense, there's nothing permanent, and yet there are memories that seem to flash back to the past in some way. I'm just curious how that works into the whole understanding of the Skandas.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I guess we could say that memory is part of our idea forming, right? Because it's not something that's happening now. It's not an immediate, sensory input. It's our idea. And of course, we know our memory of something is less than accurate, right? We can't remember anything completely. So it kind of by its nature is our perception of what happened, or our idea, because and then it's mixed with how did we respond to that, and our emotions about that, and our labels about that, and all that stuff. And it very quickly becomes an idea, which can be an idea about self, right? What was that? What did that event mean to me? What was the impact on me? Was it favorable, unfavorable, right? And then it just becomes part of our kind of story writing. That's one way to look at it, but I'm open to what others have to say about that. Please, Mark.
Well, ironically, you were talking about food, and one of the things that I read about in my previous hometown, one of my favorite restaurants had closed down, El Phoenix. And when I was sitting, unfortunately, I remembered the smell, the atmosphere of El Phoenix. And it wasn't just the El Phoenix, it was the El Phoenix in a particular location. And it wasn't just an image in my mind, it was body and mind together, a thought, feeling, and emotion. One of the things I've interpreted Dogen's concept of uji as being is that when you do remember something, it's not something from the past, but it is something present right now, right here. You are right about memory, and we can also implant false memories. There's studies on that. But when you're remembering something, not just in the mind, but also a feeling, a smell, a taste, a touch that will take you back to maybe something you've never thought of before, or you never remembered in a long, long time. It's not something in the past. It's right then, right there, now. Sure,
that act of remembering is going on in this moment, right? So, the memory could have been of something that happened a long time ago, but the action you're taking in this moment is you're remembering that and you're experiencing that. For you, I hope that was a pleasant memory. That was a restaurant you like to go to. If you're, somebody who's caught up with PTSD or trauma, it's the other way. You know, something will set you off and you're back in that traumatic experience. And yes, body and mind, I mean, you can't separate those things. So it might be, you might remember it here, but your body remembers too. I think your example is a great one about how these things are not separate, right? You can remember with all five skandhas and 4 elements because, you know, they're not separate. So I think it's interesting to consider how, as you say, the act of remembering is happening now. You know, there's no question that, you know, that's now. Whether you're accurately remembering what happened before is another question. But, you know, the experience of that idea, that story, that physical sensation is definitely this moment.
You know, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but the current sort of Western empirical understanding and kind of assertion about memory is that every memory is an active, right now, reconstruction, as opposed to the location of a little engram, a little circuit that got formed and sits in your brain somewhere, and then you go retrieve it. But that each time you remember something, it's reconstructed. And then what I don't think is fully formalized right now, but it seems to me the literature is full of it, is that most of those constructions and perceptions that are actively made and constructed almost always involve, just in terms of the circuitry that they reference, systems that are in other settings are always referred to as part of the emotional brain. So I think that the active memories that we recognize are almost, I was thinking about this when you were talking, Mark, involve these emotions as part of the memory. And that gives it that the warmth and the shimmer and the good or bad that make it so immediate. And anyway, I'm not sure if that's helpful or not, but.
Yeah, well, it's good to have an expert in the room. I mean, you study these things for a living, so it's good to have an expert in the room. Well, it's really interesting, isn't it, how immediately it's like all the aspects of ourselves get involved with that memory. You know, I mean, we can really see how just the whole creation of self can happen very, very quickly. It's not like, well, there's this, and then 5 minutes later there's that. It's like all of a sudden it's all there, and it's all interconnected. And suddenly we have, you know, we've created something or remembered something or perceived something.
When I saw the name of this gate prior to the class, and the way it was listed on the pandemic page, we had the topic done. I got kind of excited because, of course, I translated it into the kind of framework I was just speaking from. And it's been on my mind a lot recently, is how distorting the naming that we use for different circuits of the sorts I was just talking about shape the way we think about them. And the names are very arbitrary and and wind up, you know, making these little silos, and then like some of us spend a lot of time trying to break those down to make sense of the whole. So
sure. Well, really, you know, of course, as soon as we start labeling something, you know, and it could be a label that seems to not have any charge to it, but as soon as we put a label on something, then there's something that's not that. So if I label something, you know, good, there's something that's not good. If I, you know, so as soon as we want to put descriptions on things, the limitations of language come into play, right? So immediately we've kind of forgotten that, well, there is an individual and there's also a universal. So yeah, the whole naming thing is really interesting, isn't it? I remember, you know, way back when I first started practicing, and there was some discussion about Dharma names, and, you know, the conversation was a lightweight conversation, but someone said, well, no, wait a minute. Names are really important. You know, what we call something is like really important. So she was like adamant, we need to understand if we're giving somebody a Dharma name, it's like, what is that? What is that about, right? Because that whole naming thing is very important. It creates additional perceptions and additional kind of mental activity just based on the name.
I was going to add that, you know, we don't normally think of the mind in this way, but of course in, you know, the Indian understanding, the mind is a sense organ and the memory is a sense object. And, you know, our mind is it sort of ties together some of the other things that were said. So, that is happening in the present, of course.
Right.
And then I was also going to add that, I remember, I think several times during like Genzoe that, when Hojo-san is talking about Namarupa, he, will talk about the marker that he's holding, and, how when it's useful, its name is a marker, and, we get attached to that function as a marker. And then when it stops working, the name changes to trash, and we're upset about that because we were attached to the other name. So.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of his favorite illustrations, isn't it? Yeah, thank you for that. So we didn't talk about mind as a sense organ, but yes, traditionally in these cultures, mind is a sense organ. So yeah, and so thank you for reminding us, no pun intended, that memory is an object of that. So it's a bit different system than maybe, as you say, we're used to thinking about the mind in this Western culture. Sagan, please.
Yeah, in response to that, what you were saying about the mind being a sense organ and having to do with the memory, I find often, for me, the strongest memories sort of come out of listening to music sometimes, huh? Like a certain song or a certain certain tune from the past, and it really elicits sort of a holistic sense of that period of my life. It's like it almost for me it almost serves the purpose or the function of reminding me how impermanent the self is. Like at that moment of my life, I was that person. At a later moment, I was a different person. And it really kind of expands my notion. It really kind of brings, to me, it kind of brings up that sense of the universal, how flexible and how fluid our identity really is.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because if we think back to, who was I 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 5 days ago, you just think, who was that person? Like we've probably all had that experience. We look back and go, oh my gosh, who was that person? I don't think like that anymore, or I don't look like that anymore, or, I don't have that job anymore. Yeah, it's a pretty immediate demonstration of impermanence and how we think about self and what we think self is.
I think maybe, on the flip side of that, a less maybe enlightened view of memory, I think that you could also say that the mind tends to cling to memories too, because that is what forms our perceived identity, is all of these impermanent things. We make them concrete in our brains and then attach to them. So I think that, if you attach to those in terms of self-identity, that can be a major sort of driver of suffering in the Buddhist worldview. Not in the way that you described perceiving them, of course, but if you were to do it that other way, it wouldn't be so good.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I was saying to somebody the other day, in my heart and mind, I'm still a Minnesota girl. I grew up there. I mean, I spent, 40, 50 years of my life there. And yet, so in here, I feel like, well, that's my identity. But I also know here, if I was to go back to my hometown today, it would look completely different. Because, things have moved on. I would go there and I wouldn't feel like I was at home at all, because what I remember doesn't exist anymore. It's just my idea, and I'm clinging to that, and I'm saying, well, I'm a Minnesota girl. Well, maybe not, maybe I don't actually belong there anymore. Oh, that memory can be so powerful, right? And like you say, we so want to make it something. We create it and then we just so want it to be something, Very powerful element of our self-identity. Other things people would like to say? Please.
So there are these 5 skandhas and 4 elements, and as from what I understand, right, like the sense of self and the body mind arises out of this and then returns back to these elements and skandhas. So where did this this sense of permanent self then come from? And that looks like we are now caught up with this self. For in general, the norm is that we are caught up with this sense of self, and the suffering arises out of that. Yeah, and that seems to be the default state. And then you have to do a lot of spiritual practices to come out of it and then realize the actual thing. So why is this the norm, and how did we come to this? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, so this drive to create self is so deeply embedded. So Doju, chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we would look back and say there are some kind of karmic seeds, right? Because the way this thing is supposed to develop is there are some karmic seeds. In some streams and traditions, that's from a previous life. You know, some people would look at that and say it's, you know, what's led up to whatever is in this moment. Somehow there's some karmic seeds. When the conditions are right, those things come to fruition, right? So we have to have causes and conditions. So this is the playing out of karma, right? That we're in this form and that we take in sense data and that we assimilate all of these things and consciousness arises and we form this self. We create this idea of self and that we want to cling to that, right? I think it's generally seen as just sort of the karma of this human condition. Now, if we can see through that and we can slow down at least the production of that karma, then those causes and conditions unfold kind of differently. You know, we can liberate ourselves and other beings from suffering in a kind of a broad arc, right? Dojo, what does your study say about how that, you know, I'm thinking Alaya consciousness and seeds in the Alaya consciousness that sort of come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what came to mind for me, and I think it's a really important question, is, you know, the classic sort of formulation of the Four Noble Truths. So, you know, the Buddha tells us that we suffer because we crave, and then we crave because of ignorance, and that, you know, what we're ignorant about is, you know, a permanent self, basically. So I think that you could maybe say that the analysis is sort of less interested in how our clinging to, you know, the permanent self came about, but rather saying that in doing that, it's unhealthy and we should work to see the world in a different way. So, you know, I think you find this a lot in Buddhism, that they're not always interested in explaining, you know, how something came to be, like how did the universe start? You know, and the Buddha is often compared to a doctor who, you know, is there to fix a problem, not to, you know, explain in detail how it came to be. So I'm sure that later, you know, Buddhists, of course, have some explanation for it. But I think sort of fundamentally in kind of the early Buddhist context, how it happens is less important than how to fix it. So that's another, you know, way to think about it. That might not be very satisfying, but
but that's a good point, actually. Yeah, thank you for that.
So it looks like the
Please.
people with who are caught up with a lot of, let's say, karma from past karma, they tend to act in like more harmful ways. Like it continues, right? It looks like it continues. You make a lot of bad karma in, let's say, one life that seems to be continuing. There seems to be no way out of this, right? It's like if it is like just like, okay, there is more karma, so you have to suffer more, or you have to, right, like that. It seems to be continuing. There seems to be no way out of it.
Well, I think there's no guarantee that we turn that around quickly, right? So I guess it's possible to get caught up in that cycle until those causes and conditions continue to play out. But if the actions we're taking in the world are ethical actions, wholesome actions, and we're, you know, not perpetuating that unwholesome karma in the world, at some point that unfolds, right? It plays out, but it might take quite some time. We know even when Buddha had his awakening experience, he didn't, like, you know, vanish to nirvana immediately. There was enough karma still for him that he had to live out, you know, the rest of his life, experience a certain amount of suffering, even though he had had an awakening experience. So, you know, he at some point he could turn that around, but it took some time. So I think we can feel like we're caught up in that cycle and there's no way out of it. It might just be a very long cycle, right? But I think that's part of the reason why our teachers tell us we have to take skillful action in this moment as best we can with the information that we have, knowing that we can't see all the causes and conditions, and put it out there with no expectation of reward, because we don't know how it's going to play out, and we don't know how long it might take to feel some result of that, right? So it can feel discouraging, in that moment. But one small action, one small thing at a time turns the course of that, right? Skillful action that moves ourselves and other people toward understanding interconnectedness and understanding cause and effect is, that's what beneficial action is about. So if we do that, we're creating some causes and conditions for wholesomeness, but that's it's a long-term transformative process, right? What would others like to say about that? Sagan, please.
Just as you were explaining that, the image that came to my mind was applying the brakes, in a sense. Now you apply the brakes, and it takes some time before the vehicle actually stops. Right? So it's moving in the right direction, and then at the point where it stops, then you can, maybe that's sort of an analogy with, that nirvana with residue, in a sense. You're still living out a certain karmic process or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, we can all look back. You all have heard me say, I'm sure more than once, how when I started working on my genealogy, I found out that I had roots in the Deep South and my family had owned people. And I didn't know that until I started doing that work, and it really changed my self-concept. And I thought, I'm now carrying this karma, which was created long before me, but I'm feeling, the reason that I'm living in a fairly comfortable way and I, have a pretty good life is that economically, that was the basis, my family owned people. And I thought, what am I going to do with that? And I struggled with that for a long time until I finally said, well, the only thing I can do with that is to practice and to make a determination, make a vow that I'm going to use my karmic circumstances for something wholesome, so that karma can play out. I'm not going to perpetuate that karma. I'm going to make use of what I've been given the best way I can, and I wear this stuff and I do this for a living, because I can't change, I can't undo the karma that I've sort of inherited, but it's like, now what do I do with it? Well, I'm going to use the fruits of that and try to turn it around. But that's going to, look at how many generations that is. It takes a long time. So I think part of our aspiration, part of our vow, is undoing that ancient twisted karma. When we do vow and repentance, that's what we're talking about. All the, ancient twisted karma from body, speech, and mind. It's all kind of in there. We're all wrestling with that.
Does it get distributed also? Like, for example, like if you take someone like Hitler, right, who must have made a lot of this bad karma. So for him to like go through several lives and all, it seems like a pretty long way. Does it get distributed among, let's say, different people, different body minds? Is there some kind of recycling that happens across like different, both good and bad karmas?
Yeah, well, I mean, you hear about people in the Pali Canon like living 500 lives, or even in some of the Japanese traditions, people had to live like 500 lives to undo all this ancient twisted karma, right? So and of course we don't know. We can't tell, we can't see it. We don't know how long that's going to take, and it's different for everybody because we've all got different karmic conditions. So I think one of the reasons our teachers tell us not to cling to our ideas about some of that is, we don't know. All we can do is in this moment do the most wholesome action we can, and try to, burn the ancient twisted karma and turn that around a little bit. Mark, please.
Well, I mean, if you really think of the Hitler example, we are still living in his karma. The causes of his action, the causes that his actions created are enveloping our lives to this day. The UN, the formation of the UN, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, the consideration of Judaism to where it radically different today than it was even 100 years ago. And also an acceptance of Judaism and more or less a acceptance of multiculturalism and an understanding of other people and other faiths beyond just what you believe as someone as being right or wrong, those consequences, those causes that he generated, we are still living with today, and they will continue to go on. So there are your multiple lifetimes right there, right in front of us.
Yep. Talking about long term here. We probably need to wrap up just so we can get on to the World Peace Ceremony, because we still have that to do, and I know people would like to get on with the rest of their Sunday. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our closing chant. We'll take just a minute to get ourselves ready for that World Peace Ceremony, and we'll go on and do that. Does that seem okay?